in a situation that won't go away. Then there are the wasted and wounded. Those who have resigned themselves to the wounding, thinking that it is permanent, thinking it will happen again, thinking they deserve the wounding, thinking it is some sort of predestined punishment. So they waste away because of the wounding. If we think that our wounds handicapped us, interrupt our flow, or become a reason why we cannot and shall not, then they become excuses of why we don't. The wounds may be visible to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, or they may be invisible because we carry them as scars on our hearts, our minds, and our psyches. We may feel those who haven't been through what we've been through, that their lives are somehow better because they didn't go through what we went through. All right? They don't understand what we went through because there was no middle passage in their past. They didn't go through what we went through, so there's no Jim Crow or separate but equal on their resume. There's no enslavement or forced genocide in their biography. There is no Auschwitz. There's no Wounded Knee. There's no Kent State in the background of their lives. There's no racial profiling. There's no Northern Illinois University back there for them. There's no Columbine back there for them. There's no Virginia Tech back there. There's no drive-by shooting in their neighborhood. There's no home invasion where they live. There's no daily racism, consistent sexism, persistent economic classism. They don't know what we've been through, so they can't see that nobody knows the trouble I've seen. That somehow, if you think it, because they didn't go through what you went through, that they somehow have an advantage. So you may begin to think nothing good is ever going to happen because what's on your resume, in your biography, in your past, and that you're somehow stuck in a marred and marked life. And so the wounds become a pair of sunglasses that which you wear day and night. And when something good to happen, the wounds darken the rush of good feelings that come with every good and perfect gift that comes from God. It clouds your vision to your own blessings. So instead of seeing the blessings of God, you see the wounds. And because your thinking is off, that your thanking is off. So this is when the wounds get in the way. Did you see Medea's family reunion movie? How many saw Medea's? You see, there's a song in that movie that goes something like this. As time passes, they begin to multiply, adding up secretly like the rings of an old oak tree. There are wounds in the way. Some old, some new, are stifling, debilitating, and cruel. There are wounds in the way. Some are passed down from elder to youth. They don't belong to you. There are wounds in the way. As time passes, they begin to accrue a strange sort of value. So you don't think that you are worth holding on to because you don't want to change who you are. There are wounds in the way. So, how many of us would confess this morning that there are wounds that are getting in the way of our living every day? Shall we engage the text? Jesus met with his disciples after the resurrection. And unlike most of us who are more willing to hide our wounds and cloak our wounds, perfume our wounds, wardrobe our wounds, Jesus walked right in there on the first day of the week and showed them his wounds to his collection of disciples. He previously had sent them the news of the resurrection, but now he came himself. They were locked in prayer or participating in a ritual behind closed doors. They had locked themselves in and shut the door. The disciples disciples met, perhaps to know each other's mind or to strengthen one another. They were behind closed doors, maybe to work on a new strategy after what happened over the weekend, proper management of the situation, or to engage in a little damage control. The door was shut, the locks were in place, the blinds were closed, because the wounded tend to either hide or strike out and hurt somebody like they've been hurt. Yet even though the door was locked, Jesus appeared to them, which means even though they were locked in, they couldn't lock Jesus out. Somebody ought to say amen. He shows up and then shows his wounds. Have you ever wondered why he just walked in the room and showed his wounds? Some scholars, in a majority opinion, believe that Jesus showed his wounds to prove that he was the same Jesus that hung on the cross and rose from the grave. The wounds prove that he was who he said he was. He was the real Christ and he wasn't an imposter. The wounds were the evidence, the telltale signs of the resurrection. It was validation of his life and his teaching. The wounds spoke of the resurrection. Jesus is not just a good guy. He's not just another prophet or teacher, but he is the Son of God who said he was going to suffer, said he was going to die, and said he was going to rise on the third day, and he did. And so he showed his wounds. They were the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, as he was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquity. It is what Isaiah spoke about, that Jesus bore the marks of his affliction and ours in his body. Jesus walked in the house. Jesus showed his wounds. His wounds were the results of somebody else's sins and not his. Oh, baby, that's hard. For when you are wounded, not for what you did, but what for somebody else did, and what they did wounded you. Flora Schlosser Wilner writes that the showing of the wounds in the room on the first day of the week were the Lord's acts of kindness. They were acts of mercy, swift acts for friends struggling to understand what had happened over the weekend. Acts of mercy who were confused and misunderstood. It was a look and see situation. Amen. The resurrection did not blot out the wounds. He showed his wounds. The wounds were not erased. The resurrection didn't reverse the wounds. Jesus rose from the grave in spite of the wounding, with the scars and the sores that were produced by the hurt and pain of a brutal public crucifixion. The wounds themselves were a sign of healing. The scars had formed over the abrasion where his skin was scraped off as he stumbled while carrying the cross. The wounds were a sign of healing. The laceration where his flesh was torn by the leather whips. The penetrating wounds from the spear in his side. Clots had formed over the bleeding holes in his hands and his feet that indicated healing, like stretch marks on a woman's body that shows at one time new life had stretched the skin to its breaking point. It is healed now, but the scar remains. Jesus showed his wounds. They identify him with the human condition that God fully entered into our daily life through his Son, entered into the daily injustice and pain of exclusionary idioms. He passionately carries our wounds in his body, and he longs for our healing. The wounds remind us that God, through his Son, Jesus Christ, will never ignore, never negate, never minimalize the human condition. He will never be beyond our reach or our cry. For Jesus suffered for us, and he suffers for us now. Jesus shows his wounds. They are more than validate his resurrection. It also demonstrates that in spite of what happened to him on Calvary, he didn't let his wounds get in the way. The wounds of his descent did not prevent his ascent. The wounds of his demise did not get in the way of his comeback. The wounds of his downfall did not prevent his uprising. The wounds from his humiliation did not prevent his elevation. The wounds of his agitation temptation did not get in the way of the uprising motivation. The wounds of his crucifixion did not get in the way of his glorification. The wounds did not get in the way.